Chapter 40, The Life Tony Built. Time skip, Tony's new house. Tony walked out of the house, and he notices Astrid, who no one knew about, not even his team working on something. But he didn't interrupt her. Instead, he walks over to the tent and starts to clap in his hands. Chow time, Maguna. Morgan H. Stark. Do you want some lunch? A child with the blue Iron Man mask comes out of the tent. Define lunch or be disintegrated. Tony looks over to Morgan. Okay, you should not be wearing that, okay? That is part of a special anniversary gift I'm making for Mum. Tony kisses the helmet before removing the it. Morgan does a little smile as she removes her hair out of her face with Tony. There you go, you thinking about lunch? Tony asks her and Morgan nods. I can give you a handful of crickets on a bed of lettuce. No, Morgan says as she shook her head, and Tony does a little chuckle. That's what you want, Tony says, then lifts up the helmet and looks at her. How did you find this? Morgan looks at the helmet, then shrugs her shoulders. Garage. Tony looks at her with a little shock and suspicion on his face. Really? Were you looking for it? Morgan does a little giggle as she shook her head. No, I found it though. Astrid does a little smirk as she overheard their conversation, but she doesn't interrupt. You like going in the garage, huh? Tony asks Morgan before standing up and lifting Morgan up. So, does Daddy? Tony teases Morgan as he walks over to the house. It's fine, actually. Mom never wears anything I buy her. As Tony walks back over to the house, he notices Astrid, his eldest daughter, walking over. You promised not to tell anyone I helped you with the helmet designs, remember? Astrid calls out teasingly. Tony stops and raised a brow. Yeah. And you promised not to leave your prototypes all over my workbench. Astrid puts her hand on her chest in mocking of offence. That's called collaboration, Dad. She laughs, and she sees Morgan trying to wiggle free from Tony before Tony puts her down, and Morgan runs over to her and she lifts her up. Morgan giggles as she tells Astrid, Asti, Daddy said he'd give me bugs for lunch. Astrid laughs. Gross, but knowing him, I wouldn't put it past him. Tony looks at her with offended look in his eyes. Excuse me, I'm a man of fine culinary standards. Lettuce and crickets are organic protein. Thank you very much. Astrid rolled her eyes, walking toward the porch. Mum's making grilled cheese genius. Before Tony can follow, however, a sleek back Audi pulls up, and he sees Steve, Natasha and Scott exit the car. Astrid looks over to Tony as she sees the look on his face. Avengers business? Tony looks over to her as Astrid put Morgan down. Yeah, don't worry about it, kiddo. Go help your mum inside, all right? Astrid hesitated. Are you sure, Dad? Tony nods before side-hugging her. Yeah, I got it. Astrid nods before taking Morgan's hand. As they walk back toward the house, Morgan waves enthusiastically at Steve. Hi, Captain! Morgan calls out cheerfully. Steve smiled gently, watching them disappear inside, and his mind flickers to Laila for a moment. Morgan would be older than his child right now before his gaze fell back on Tony. Time, skip, porch of the cabin. Scott stammers as he explains his theory. No, we know what it sounds like. Steve cuts in. Tony, after everything you've seen, is anything really impossible? Quantum fluctuation messes with the Planck scale, which then triggers the Deutsch proposition. Can we agree on that? Tony says as he passes everyone a glass. In layman's terms, it means you're not coming home. I did, Scott spoke up. Tony looks back at him. No, you accidentally survived. Tony sighs to himself. It's a 1,000,000,000 cosmic fluke. And now you want to pull a... What do you call it? Scott hesitates for a moment. A time heist? Tony chuckles. Yeah, a time heist, of course. Why didn't we think of this before? Oh, because it's laughable, because it's a pipe dream. Steve looks at Tony. The stones are in the past. We could go back, we could get them. Natasha adds in, we can snap our own fingers. We can bring everybody back. Tony looks over to Natasha. Or screw it up worse than he already has, right? Steve shakes his head. I don't believe we would. Tony raises his hand at Steve. Gotta say it, I sometimes miss that giddy optimism. However, high hopes won't help. If there's no logical, tangible way for me to safely execute said time heist. Tony sat down. I believe the most likely outcome will be our collective demise. Scott stood up. Not if we strictly follow the rules of time travel. All right? It means no talking to our past selves. No betting on sporting events. Tony takes a sip of his drink before realizing the movie he's referring to. I'm gonna stop you right there, Scott. Are you seriously telling me that your plan to save the universe is based on Back to the Future, isn't it? Scott does a little chuckle. No. Good. You had me worried there, 'cause that would be horseshit. Tony tells Scott. That's not how quantum physics works. Natasha, after looking down, she looks at Tony. Tony, we have to take a stand. Tony looks at her. We did stand. And yet, here we are. Scott speaks up again. I know you got a lot on the line. You got a wife, 2 daughters, but I lost someone very important to me. A lot of people did. Tony looks at Scott for a minute before at Steve as he thought about Peter, Scarlett, and Layla, then back at Scott. And now we have a chance to bring her back, to bring everyone back. Scott continues as he looks at Natasha and Steve before back at Tony. And you're telling me that you won't even... Tony cuts in. That's right, Scott. I can't. The sound of the door closing and Tony looks over to Morgan and Astrid. Mommy told me to come and save you. Morgan tells Tony as she walks over to Tony, and Tony's gaze shifts to Astrid, who crosses her arms but gives him a small smile. Tony picks her up. Good job. I'm saved. He looks over to Scott, Steve, and Natasha. I wish you were coming here to ask me something else. Tony stands up, still holding Morgan. Anything else? I'm honestly happy to see you guys. Oh, look. He points to the chairs. The table's set for 6. Steve stops him. Tony, I get it and I'm happy for you. I really am. But this is a second chance. Tony looks at Steve before pointing to Astrid and Morgan. I got my second chance right here, Cap. Can't roll the dice on it. Tony looks at the others. If you don't talk shop, you can stay for lunch. Astrid, who stayed quiet at the doorway, looked between them. The Avengers who once filled her father's life, and the quiet world that replaced them. And she follows Tony and Morgan inside. Natasha, Scott and Steve walked back to the car. Well, he's scared, Natasha suggested. He's not wrong, Steve tells her before looking at Scott. Yeah, but I mean, what are we going to do? Scott asks as he looks at Steve. We need him. What are we going to stop? Steve shook his head. No, I want to do it right. We're going to need a really big brain. Scott looks back at the house before at Steve. Bigger than his? Chapter 41. Quest to time travel. Time skip. Cafeteria. Natasha, Steve, and Scott looks at Bruce, or shall I say Professor Hulk. Come on, I feel like I'm the only one eating here. Try some of that. Bess tells them as he pushes the eggs over to Scott. Have some eggs. Scott looks at him confused. I'm so confused. Bruce chuckles. These are confusing times. Scott shakes his head. Right. No, that's not what I meant. Nah, I get it. I'm kidding. Bruce tells Scott as he lifts his arm up. I know, it's crazy. I'm wearing shirts now. Scott nods, but still confused. Yeah. What? How? Why? 5 years ago, we got our asses beat, except it was worse for me, because I lost twice. First, Hulk lost, then Banner lost, and then we all lost, Bruce explains. Natasha shakes her head slightly. No one blames you, Bruce. Bruce looks at her. I did. For years, I've been treating the Hulk like he's some kind of disease, something to get rid of. But then, I start looking at him as the cure. 18 months in the Gamma Lab, I put the brains and the brawn together. And now, look at me. Best of both worlds. Steve thinks to himself, as he knows how sassy Layla would have gotten, but he doesn't speak and notices a family walking over to Bruce. Excuse me, Mr. Hulk? One child says to get Bruce's attention. Yes? Bruce looks at the family, smiling. Can we get a photo? Another child asks. 100%, little person? Bruce accepts and takes a photo with them as Scott took the picture. Scott looks over to the kids. Did you want to grab one with me? I'm Ant-Man. The children didn't answer, so Scott shook his head. They're Hulk fans. They don't know Ant-Man. Nobody does. Bruce tries to reassure him. No, he wants you to take a picture with him. Scott shakes his head. No, I don't want a picture. Boy, one looks at Bruce. Stranger, danger. Scott points to the kid. Yeah, look, he's even saying no, he doesn't. I get it. I don't want it either. Bruce and Scott argues for a moment, and Steve and Natasha looks uncomfortable. Steve looks at Bruce. Bruce? Bruce does the dab at the kid. Dab. Steve speaks a little louder. Bruce? Bruce points to the kids. Listen to your mum, she knows better. Steve looks at Bruce again. About what we were saying. Bruce looks at Steve before looking away as he nods. Right. The whole time travel do-over? Guys, it's outside of my area of expertise. Natasha looks at Bruce as she shakes her head. Well, you pulled this off. Bruce does a little smile at that as Natasha continues. I remember a time when that seemed pretty impossible too. Time skip, Avengers compound. Bruce speaks up as he checks the controls. Okay, here we go. Time travel test, number 1, Scott. Fire up the, van thing. Scott walks over to the van and opens up the back doors to reveal the portal. Steve walks into the room. Breakers are set. Emergency generators are on standby. Bruce looks over to Steve. Good, because if we blow the grid, I don't want to lose Tiny here in 1950s. Scott looks straight at Bruce. Excuse me? Natasha smirks as she presses on the table. He's kidding. You can't say things like that. Bruce stammers as he looks over at Scott. It was a bad joke. Scott looks away as he nods to himself before walking over to the van. Natasha looks over to Bruce. You were kidding, right? Bruce looks at Natasha as he shrugs his shoulders. I have no idea. We're talking about time travel here. Either it's all a joke or none of it is. Bruce looks over to Scoot as he puts his thumbs up. We're good. Get your helmet on. As Scott puts his helmet on, Bruce continues. Scott, I'm going to send you back a week. Let you walk around for an hour, then bring you back in 10 seconds. Make sense? Scott looks confused for a moment before shrugging it off. Perfectly not confusing. Steve looks at Scott. Good luck, Scott. You got this. Scott nods before he disappears. You're right. I do, Captain America. Bruce presses a button, and Scott disappears into the quantum tunnel. On the count of 3. 3, 2, 1. Bruce says as he presses a button and teenage Scott comes out. Scott looks at himself before at the team. Guys? This doesn't feel right. Steve looks at Scott before looking at Bruce. What is this? Bruce looks at the control as he mutters, "What's going on?" Natasha looks at Scott. "Who is that?" Bruce presses some more buttons as he starts to panic. "Hold on!" Natasha looks over to Steve, confused. "Is that Scott?" Scott, as a teenager, looks over to Natasha. "Yes, it's Scott." Bruce presses a button again, and Scott disappears back in the quantum tunnel. Steve looks at Bruce. "What's going on, Bruce?" An old Scott appears, and he reaches for his back. "Oh, my back!" Steve looks more confused. "What is this?" Steve could almost hear a little chuckle as he imagines Layla's reaction to this chaos. Bruce presses the button again. "Hold on a second. Could I get a little space here?" Steve walks over to Natasha. Yes. Can you bring him back?" Bruce presses all the buttons again. "I'm working on it." Natasha looks over to Steve and back at Scott as Bruce taps the side of controls and baby Scott appears. Steve looks at baby Scott and shakes his head, now hearing a laugh in his mind. "It's a baby." Bruce points at baby Scott. "It's Scott." Steve looks at Bruce. "As a baby." Bruce shrugs his shoulders. "He'll grow." Steve looks at him. "Bring Scott back." Bruce looks at him as his finger lingered on one button. "When I say kill the power, kill the power." Natasha walks over to the power station. "Oh, my God." Bruce presses the buttons. "And kill it." Natasha kills off the power as Bruce pulls the lever. Normal Scott came back. Scott looks at them. "Somebody peed my pants." Natasha does a little sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God." Scott closes his eyes in embarrassment. "But I don't know if it was baby me or old me, or just me. Bruce looks over to Steve and Natasha. "Time travel." Steve sighs as he shakes his head before walking off, his mind still picturing Layla laughing at the chaos. Bruce looks at him. "What?" "I see this as an absolute win. Chapter 42, The Time-Space GPS. Time skip. Outside of the compound, Steve walks over before leaning against the pillar as he sighs, as he thinks to himself before he hears engine roaring, and he looks over to the noise. A black car pulls up and Tony winds down his window before looking at Steve. "Why, the long face?" "Let me guess, he turned into a baby." Steve looks up and makes a little nod. "Among other things, yeah." "What are you doing here?" Tony looks at him as he gets out of the car. "It's the EPR paradox. Instead of pushing Lang through time, you might have wound up pushing time through Lang. It's tricky, dangerous. Someone could have cautioned you against it." "You did?" Steve replies as he looks at him. Tony looked away for a moment before looking back at Steve. "Oh, did I? Well, thank God I'm here. Regardless, I fixed it." Tony raised his hand and a device is shown. "A fully functioning time-space GPS. I just want peace." Steve does a little smile as Tony continues. "Turns out, resentment is corrosive, and I hate it." "Me too," Steve tells him. Tony nods a bit as he thought of Scarlett, his sister, and Peter. "We got a shot at getting these stones, but I gotta tell you my priorities. Bring back what we lost, I hope. Yes. Keep what I found. I have to, at all costs. And maybe not die trying. Would be nice." Steve nods before taking his hand out to shake Tony's hand. "Sounds like a deal." Tony takes Steve's hand and shakes his hand before he walks to the back of his car and takes out the shield. Steve looks at the shield as he sighs. "Tony, I don't know." Tony looks at him as he holds the shield. "Why?" "He made it for you. Plus, honestly, I have to get it out of the garage before Morgan takes it sledding or Astrid upgrades it somehow. Tony gives the shield back to Steve, and Steve looks over to him. Thank you, Tony. Tony nods a little. Will you keep that a little quiet? Didn't bring one for the whole team. We are getting the whole team, yeah? Steve nods after Tony spoke. We're working on that right now. Tony and Steve walk into the building. Chapter 43. The Worthy and the Willing. Time skip, Avengers compound. Tony walks past Thor carrying a lead. You're drifting left. One side there, Lebowski. Tony walks over to Rocket as he calls out. Rashay, how's it going? Rocket working on the machine. It's Rocket! Take it easy, you're only a genius on Earth, pal. Tony looks at Rocket before shaking his head as Thor burps, and Tony looks at him in disgust at that. Inside another room. Scott is in a white and red suit, similar to Ant-Man's suit, and Rhodes walks in. Time travel suit? Not bad, Rhodes tells them. Bruce puts a tube into Scott's suit, and Scott stops him. Hey, easy, easy. Bruce looks at Scott. I'm being very careful. Scott looks at him before at the tube. No, you're being very hulky. Bruce crosses his arms. I'm being careful. Scott raises up his hand that has the tube. These are Pym particles, all right? And ever since Hank Pym got snapped out of existence, this is it. This is what we have. We're not making any more. Rhodes raises his hand slightly to gesture. Calm down. As he tells Scott. Scott, calm down. Scott sighs as he looks down. Sorry. We've got enough for one round trip each. That's it. No do-overs, plus 2 test runs. Scott puts the tube into the pocket, and Scott yells as he disappears, and after a few minutes, he comes back. Scott looks at Bruce and Rhodes. 1 test run. Rhodes sighs to himself and shakes his head. Scott sighs to himself as well, but to hype himself up. All right, I'm not ready for this. A voice calls out, I'm game! Everyone looks over to Clint. I'll do it. Another voice cuts through. Me too. Everyone looks over to Ashley. Bruce does a little nod to her, knowing she lost Loki, before he tells Ashley that Clint is doing the test, and Ashley nods. Nebula touches the hologram to finish something up as Bruce speaks. Clint, now you're going to feel a little discombobulated from the chrono shift. Don't worry about it. Rhodes cuts in. Wait a second. Let me ask you something if we can do this. You know, go back in time. Why don't we just find baby Thanos? You know, and he gestures away to kill baby Thanos. Bruce looks at him. First of all, that's horrible. Rhodes looks confused. It's Thanos. Bruce cuts him off. And secondly, time doesn't work that way. Changing the past doesn't change the future. Scott speaks up. Look, we go back, we get the stones before Thanos gets them. Thanos doesn't have the stones. Problem solved. Clint looks from Scott to Bruce. Bingo. Nebula shakes her head. That's not how it works. Clint looks over to Nebula. That's what I heard. Bruce looks confused at Nebula. Wait, but who? Who told you that? Rhodes lists off the shows with help from Clint and Scott. Star Trek, Terminator, Time Cop, Time After Time, Quantum Leap, Wrinkle in Time, Somewhere in Time, Hot Tub Time Machine, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Basically, any movie that deals with time travel. Scott shrugs his shoulders. Die Hard. No, that's not one. Rhodes cuts him off to finish off. This is known. Bruce raises his arms. I don't know why everyone believes that, but that isn't true. Think about it. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. Nebula agrees with Bruce. Exactly. Scott looks down. So, Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit. Time skip. Another room. Clint is standing on the machine as everyone is gathered around. Bruce presses the buttons. All right, Clint? We're going in 3, 2, 1. Bruce starts the machine and Clint disappears. After a while, Bruce brought Clint back. Laila! Clint yells as he's back, but distracted before looking up, and everyone runs over to him. Natasha helps up Clint. Hey, look at me. You okay? Clint looks at her before looking away. Yeah. Natasha and Clint looks over to Tony. It worked, as he throws something at Tony. Time skip. War room. Steve looks at the hologram. Okay, so the how works. Now, we gotta figure out then, when, and the where. Steve looks over to everyone. Almost everyone in this room has had an encounter with at least one of the 6 Infinity Stones. Tony speaks up. Or substitute the word encounter for damn near killed by one of the 6 Infinity Stones. Scott tells them. Well, I haven't, but I don't even know what the hell you're all talking about. Bruce cuts in. Regardless, we only have enough Pym particles in a lot of different places throughout history. Tony speaks up. Our history. So, not a lot of convenient spots to just drop in, yeah? Clint tells everyone, which means we have to pick our targets. Tony points at Clint before looking away. Correct. Steve speaks up. So, let's start with the ether. Thor, what do you know? Everyone turns to look at Thor, who is asleep on a chair. Natasha asks everyone, Is he asleep? Rhodes answers, No. I'm pretty sure he's dead. Thor wakes up after a while and removes his sunglasses. Where to start? The ether, firstly, is not a stone. Someone called it a stone before. Thor points at Steve, who made a confused face as Thor continues. It's more of an angry sludge sort of thing. So someone's going to need to amend that and stop saying that. Thor rubs his eyes. Here's an interesting story, though, about the ether. My grandfather, many years ago, had to hide the stone from the dark elves. Thor shakes his fingers to mimic a scary thing. Ooh, he chuckles. Scary beings. Thor touches the hologram to swipe something, and a picture of Jane pops up. So, Jane... Oh, there she is. Yeah, so Jane was an old friend of mine. You know, she stuck her hand inside a rock this one time, and then the ether stuck itself inside her, and she became very, very sick. And so I had to take her to Asgard, which is where I'm from, and we had to try and fix her. Thor thinks for a moment, as his true love and his sister was snapped before breaking out of his train of thoughts. We were close friends, Jane and I. She trusted me, and I couldn't let her face the ether alone. Steve notices Thor's expression slowly changing as Thor speaks. I introduced her to my mother, who's dead. And, well, Jane and I were never a couple, Thor says, his eyes misting. She was important to me, but things change. Now I'm dating Regina Watson, who was also snapped away alongside my sister Layla. Regina was Athena's sister, and somehow she makes me feel like I'm still worthy. Tony walks over to Thor to help him sit down. Why don't you come? Sit down. Thor stops him. I'm not done yet. The only thing that is permanent in life is impermanence. That's poetic, Thor. But maybe save the existential crisis after we save the universe, Ashley said, gently but firmly. We need you focused. Jane's and Regina's story matters, but right now, so do the rest of us. Thor laughs to himself as Clint and Rhodes looks at each other in confusion. Tony claps his hand before touching Thor's shoulder. Awesome. Eggs? Breakfast? Thor shakes his head. No, I'd like a Bloody Mary. Chapter 44. The plans. Time skip. War room. A hologram is showing the objective of the stones as everyone is eating, and Rocket speaks up. Quill said he stole the Power Stone from Morag. Bruce looks at the screen confused. Is that a person? Rocket looks over to Bruce. No, Morag's a planet. Quill was the person. Scott looks at Rocket as he's eating. Like a planet? Like in outer space? Rocket looks over to Scott and pats his head. Oh, look. It's like a little puppy, all happy and everything. Do you want to go to space? You want to go to space, puppy? I'll take you to space. Ashley hides her smile behind her cup, but her shoulders shake, signalling she's laughing, then she clears her throat. You'd better pack snacks, she says dryly. Puppies tend to get motion sick. Scott finishes his food as he shakes his head. Steve watches the interaction and does a little chuckle, a brief flicker of old ease, but it fades quickly as he thought to himself. Layla would have said something like that. Something dry but kind, something that made everyone relax without trying. Time skip. Planning room. Nebula looks at the hologram as she speaks. Thanos found the Soul Stone on Vormir. Natasha is writing down the plan. What is Vormir? Nebula looks over to her. A dominion of death, at the very centre of celestial existence. Everyone looks over to her as Nebula looks away from everyone. It's where Thanos murdered my sister. Everyone besides Steve looks at her in sadness. Steve looks down in sadness and he sighs. Ashley exhales slowly before she starts to speak. Vormir. Loki mentioned it once. He didn't think much of it as he didn't know the stone was there. Steve glances at her, quietly, respectfully, before looking back at Nebula. Even though how it happened was different, he lost Layla from the snap. Ashley lost Loki from Thanos. Ashley had already made up her mind, not knowing that Clint and Natasha thought of the same thing. Scott looks around for a moment before speaking up to break the silence. Not it. Time skip. Dinner table. Everyone looks over to him before looking at the hologram again. Natasha looks at the hologram. That time stone guy? Bruce looks at her. Dr. Strange. Natasha looks confused. Yeah, what kind of doctor was he? Tony speaks up. Ear, nose, throat, meats, rabbit from hat. Bruce looks at the ceiling. Nice place in the village, though. Tony rubs his eyes. Yeah, on Sullivan Street? Bruce checks his glasses. Bleecker Street. Natasha looks confused again. Wait, he lived in New York? Tony shakes head. No, he lived in Toronto. Bruce looks over to them. Yeah, on Bleecker and Sullivan. Tony raised his hands. Have you been listening to anything? Natasha looks at them. Guys, if you pick the right year, there are 3 stones in New York. Bruce and Tony sits up fast, and Bruce says, Shut the front door. Time skip. Planning room again. Steve paces back and forth as he speaks. All right, we have a plan. 6 stones, 3 teams, 1 shot. Ashley nods, eyes flickering towards the Soul Stone's glowing mark. There's a heaviness in her chest that she doesn't voice. Time skip. Quantum room. Everyone gather at the quantum platform. and Steve stepped forward and looks over to everyone. 5 years ago, we lost. Steve starts. All of us. We lost friends, family. Steve stopped speaking for a moment as he thought about Laila, remembering how calm she was at Thanksgiving dinner 4 months earlier of civil war, and how threatening she was at Pietro before he speaks again. We lost a part of ourselves. Steve pauses again, taking a deep breath before looking back at the team. Today, we have a chance to take it all back. You know your teams. You know your missions. Get the stones. Get them back. 1 round trip each. No mistakes. No do-overs. Most of us are going somewhere we know. That doesn't mean we should know what to expect. Be careful. Look out for each other. This is the fight of our lives, and we're gonna win. Tony does a little smile as he listens to Steve before both of them look at each other, and Steve finishes it off with, "Whatever it takes." They both look away, and Steve tells the group, "Good luck." Ashley nods and she looks over to Natasha and Clint as Rocket looks over to Scott. "He's pretty good at that." Scott nods as he looks at Rocket, then Steve. "Right?" Tony speaks up. "All right, you heard the man. Stroke those keys, Jolly Green." Clint looks at the tiny Benatar as Bruce tells Tony, "Trackers engaged." Rocket looks at Clint. "You promise to bring that back in one piece, right?" Clint looks at Rocket before looking away. Yes. Okay, I'll do my best." Rocket crosses his arms. "As promises go, that was pretty lame." Natasha does a little smile as she looks over to Steve. "See you in a minute?" Steve smiled back before looking away. Ashley breathes in and out as the machine starts, and everyone puts on their helmet on and they jumped through time. Chapter 45. Echoes of 2012. Time skip, New York 2012. The Chitauri snarls as they land on the side of the buildings as the 2012 Avengers prepare for battle. But across the street, Steve, Tony, Bruce and Scott from 2023 appears. Steve steps forward looking at the city. "All right, we all have our assignments. 2 stones uptown, 1 stone down. Stay low, keep an eye on the clock." 2012. Hulk smashes one of the cars that caught everyone's attention, but the Hulk ran off to fight more Chitauris, which makes Bruce cringe a little as Steve looks at him. Steve tells Bruce, "Maybe smash a few things along the way?" Bruce sighs as he looks at Steve before ripping off his shirt. "I think it's gratuitous, but whatever." Bruce walks over to the car and roars softly as he doesn't want to it, and punches an abandoned taxi before lifting up a motorbike and throwing it away. Steve and Tony walks over to the Stark Tower. As they're walking over, a voice caught Steve's attention, and he looks at one of the streets and sees 2012 Thor next to a brown-haired woman who turned around to reveal that it's 2012 Laila. "Who the hell is doing all of this?" Laila asks Thor, at the time both of them not knowing that they're brother and sister. "My brother, Loki." "Well, my adoptive brother," Thor replies as he throws his Mjolnir at one of the ships. "Wow, what an asshole," Laila tells him. Steve froze for a moment as he watches the fight, where Laila and Thor teamed up to stop the Chitauris before Tony snaps him out of it and he walks to the Stark Tower again. With Bruce, a rooftop. Bruce jumps on top of a roof and he walks over to the doors of the rooftop before a female voice calls out, "I'd be careful going in that way, we just had the floors waxed." Bruce looks over to the woman who is named as the Ancient One. She looks at Bruce as Bruce walks over to her. Bruce hesitates with a soft smile on his face. "Yeah, I'm looking for Dr. Strange." The Ancient One looks at him with raised brows for a moment. "You're about 5 years too early. Stephen Strange is currently performing surgery about 20 blocks that way." She points to her right before looking at Bruce again. "What do you want from him?" Bruce notices the time stone in the Eye of Agamotto that is on her, and he points it out. That, actually? She looks down before looking back at Bruce. Ah, I'm afraid not. Bruce shrugs his shoulders as he walks over to her. Sorry, but I wasn't asking. The Ancient One looks at Bruce. You don't want to do this. Ah, you're right, I don't. But I need that stone. Bruce tells her as he walks closer. And I don't have time to debate it. The Ancient One pushes Bruce's astral form out of his body. Bruce, who is now in astral form, looks at her horrified.